I believe I'm on now. Good evening and greetings, brethren, from the folks at Conyers. It is my honor and privilege to be with you tonight. Very thankful for the opportunity to be here, and I'm thankful just to get over on this side of town. Sometimes, you know, when we cross town, just going across Atlanta, it can be quite an adventure. This afternoon, I was expecting, as I often have when I come to this side of town for a board meeting at Camp Inagahee, I will get stuck around Douglasville coming through in the afternoon traffic. So I planned to get out of town ahead of time, and I did. And before I got out of Conyers, there was a car turned upside down on the wall. So I got hung up even before I got going. But I got here in plenty of time, and things were working well also. And I'm very thankful again for the opportunity to be here. And tonight, as we gather as God's people, I want to challenge you to think about something. When we gather for Bible study as God's people, we need to have the thought process that says, I'm going to draw one step closer to God every time I delve into His Word. Now, sometimes we take big steps. Sometimes we take small steps. But the idea is tonight, as we look at what we find in Daniel chapter 3, talking about these fireworks, the question is, as I draw closer to God, who's really got the power? Who really and truly has the power? I don't know why my iPad wanted to turn everything upside down. That's kind of unusual there. We're going to be spending our time primarily in Daniel chapter 3 tonight, looking at these things concerning King Nebuchadnezzar and these three Hebrew men. You know, King Nebuchadnezzar was, well, arrogant. And as we look at his life, I want to ask you something. Do you know anybody that's arrogant? Do you know anybody that's arrogant? Somebody who thinks they've got it all figured out. Not only do they have it all figured out, but they've got it all in control. You know, I read a story recently about a young lady who was complaining about her ex-boyfriend. You see, he was a doctor, and he was going to medical school or finishing medical school. And they had broken up. They weren't dating anymore. And she was complaining to her friend, and she said, can you believe that he made me return all the presents that he gave me during the time that we were dating? And her friend said, wow, I can't believe that. What an arrogant guy. And she said, no, that's nothing. He charged me for 32 house calls. Okay, that took a minute to get there. All right. Some people are arrogant, aren't they? They expect a lot. They think they've got it all figured out. And as we look at King Nebuchadnezzar, he makes me think of a sign that I once saw on the front of a house. It said, don't worry about the dog, beware of the owner. And that's where King Nebuchadnezzar was. He was in control, and he had all of this working for him. And Daniel chapter 3 is one of those points in history that we look at, and we think we've got it all figured out ourselves because we remember these things being told to us since we were very small. You see, I'm very careful about using the word story. Do you know why? What we find in God's book, these aren't stories here, these are histories. Start thinking about it that way, that these were real people in real time. It makes us look at them just a little bit differently. You know, when we look at this, we can't help but think that we've learned these passages upside down, forward, and backward. And yet, I believe that we neglect some simple truth. Because when we look at Daniel chapter 3, we see King Nebuchadnezzar, we see the three Hebrew young men, and we say this sets the stage, and yet we miss something very important. got the power and who's in control. You see, we often think about this and say to ourselves, well, we do the right thing, God takes care of us, yada, yada. But wait a minute. When we think about this trial of fire, if you will, there are some things that are a lot deeper than simply those things we learned when we were small. If you will, turn with me to Daniel chapter 1. We'll start right there. And if you, I don't know if we would click a slide. Okay. Does that go forward? There we go. As we look at Daniel chapter 1 here, we see power that is perplexed, or power that's confused. Now, why do I say that this is power that's confused? You know, we often think about fire as being very powerful, don't we? Fire being very powerful. I remember when I was working with Newton County as a volunteer fireman, going to an apartment fire one time, and the whole building that we were responding to was engulfed by the time I got there. My heart just dropped. It was a scary thing to think about. All of that was going on. And then another building was on fire, so we went inside and fought the fire in that building. And there's a whole other tale of experience that I had there. But the idea is this, that we think of power as being very powerful, and yet we look here in chapter 1 of Daniel, and I think we see some power that's confused. Now watch with me. Well, in the 3rd year, the reign of Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, into Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure of the house of his God. And the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and the king's seed, and of the princes, and children in whom was no blemish, but well and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning and knowledge, and understanding and science, and such as had ability to them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, and at the end thereof, that they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So here we're introduced to Daniel, Hananiah, and Azariah, known as Belteshazzar, Shadrach, and Abednego. Now I'd like to draw your attention to a small phrase. And this is why I say that power that is perplexed, or power that is confused. In verse 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, the king, into his hand. The hand of Nebuchadnezzar. God gave Try this now. There we go. Hey. Used to say Verizon. Now the guy jumped ship, so it's no longer, can you hear me now? Anyway, what do we think about when we consider our accomplishments? Are we thankful to God for the talents that we have, for the hands that we have, for the feet that we have, the eyes, the ears? Where are our minds going when we have those great accomplishments? Because when problems come our way, I guarantee you we're on our knees begging God to help us. We remember where God is then, but what about when things are going well? Just because the moment is such that we're not being tried by fire doesn't send us necessarily into a place that we need to forget God, should it? But yet we will do that sometimes. We need not be perplexed about the greatest power. It is said that there was a great team of doctors who had come across a discovery working for the devil himself and had challenged God and said, you know what, we'll meet you, God, on the table, and we'll show you that we figured out how to create life. You've heard the tale? And then God meets them at the table with a challenge, and they said, here, all we're going to do is we're going to take this dirt and we're going to make somebody just like you did. And God said, you got to get your own dirt. Too many times we take for granted the fundamental things that God has given us. I remember when my daughter was small, and in her little prayer she would say, thank you, God, for the blue and green world. We need to start fundamentally thinking this way as we meet the challenges that come upon us. You know, when we get to Daniel chapter 2, there at verse 48, we see that time has passed, and Nebuchadnezzar has thought pretty highly of himself, and he was probably encouraged by his own staff. They were very patriotic. They wanted to suck up to him because I think they wanted to see themselves in his seat at some point. That's what they were doing. So we have to remember as we go through these things that God is the one who gives us all that we have, and God is where the real power is. Now flip on over to chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold whose height was about 60 cubits and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. Now that was 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. That's pretty big. He set it up in the plain of Dura, the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and the rulers in the provinces to come up with the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. He had the whole party there. He had invited everybody who was of any authority. Everybody come and see. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the sheriffs, the rulers of the provinces were gathered together under the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried out, to you is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. So when you hear the music, it said, that's the time. Everybody wasn't running around with a Timex. So when you hear the music, that's the time that you are to bow down. And whoso falls not down and worships the same be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now there's some bad news. There's some really bad news. You don't get time out. You get thrown into the fiery furnace. You know, you do a little research on these things, and here's what you find out, that in this point in history, there were a lot of different kinds of furnaces. And what they assert that this particular furnace was most likely what we would call today a crematorium. It would be something large, a place, because that's what they did with their dead. They cremated their bodies. And so you know the fire would already have been hot. So this would be a real challenge here. Therefore, at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people of the nations and language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Life is good in Babylon. Everybody is doing what they are supposed to be doing. They're bowing down. And by the way, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what would it hurt if you just bowed down? What difference would it have made? I mean, even the king knew make you worship him, but you could look like everybody else and assimilate, right? Huh. But yet, power is something that Nebuchadnezzar perceived that he had, that in reality he did not. He wasn't in charge of these things by his own choosing. God placed him there. So this power that was perceived was one that enabled him to persecute the people. We look in verse 8. We see there tattlers and threats beginning in verse 8. Wherefore at that time, certain of the Chaldeans came near and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O live forever. O king, you have made a decree that every man shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whosoever falls not down and worships, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now there are certain Jews whom you've set over the affairs of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, not to name anybody else. These men, O king, have not regarded you. They have served not your gods, nor worship the golden image you've set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded them to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they brought these men before. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do you not serve my gods, nor worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you be ready, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made, well. But if you worship not, you will be cast that same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hand? You see who thought he had power? Who perceived that he had power? You know, as we look at these precious verses here this evening, I think you and I can find some things to help us today. You see, these things that were written aforetime were written for our learning. And I believe if we study these things carefully, we can find some interesting, because I wonder, have you ever been threatened because of your godliness? Now, it might not be someone holding a gun to your head. I understand that. But what about in a social arena? You know, for years, I worked for a company that produced swimming pool chemicals. And during those years that I worked for that company that produced those chemicals, there were meetings that went on in, let's just say, establishments that I would not attend. And do you know, I was picked at, laughed at, and sometimes I believe I was passed over for promotions because I wasn't in on the inside track, because there were places that I just would not go. Have you ever been persecuted for your stance for Christianity? For your willingness to do what was right? Because you see, sometimes you don't have to be aggressive. The devil will bring the battle to you. He will bring the battle to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were just trying to mind their own business. But the devil would bring the battle to them as well. When we consider these things, we can see that these men were persecuted because of their standards. The golden image that was set up that we read about in verses 1 through 7, and it would appear that Nebuchadnezzar had most likely set up an image of himself even, and they refused to bow to that image, and their faith in God would not allow them to stoop to the level of the pagans all around them. In other words, their standards and their manner of life made them different from others around them in that day. As Christians, we need to be those who have a different set of standards, different from what the world would hold. When we look at 2 Corinthians 6:17, there we read these words, "Wherefore come out from them among them, and separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing. I will receive you." In Colossians 3, verses 1 and 2, "If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is on the right hand of God. Set your affections on the things above, not on the things of the earth." And then we see in 1 Peter chapter 2, "Beloved, I urge you as pilgrims and exiles, to abstain from the passions of the flesh which war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against doers, they may see your good deeds and glorify the God on the day of visitation." They were persecuted because of their standards. Have you been persecuted because of your standards? Understand this. When you walk with God, you're not alone. Now, the devil's going to try to make you think you are. He's going to want to make you feel like you are in the minority. He's going to want to make you feel like there's no point in going any further. But rest assured, there is always a point in standing for God. It's always valuable to stand for what's right. And sometimes we don't have to be aggressive. We don't have to be mean. Sometimes the devil will bring the battle to us. And we look at these three Hebrew men, and we also see that they were persecuted because of their Savior. Not only because of their standards, but also because of their Savior. Nebuchadnezzar, in his challenge, he gave them a second chance. Did you see that? He gave them a second chance. He called them in before him and asked if it was really true that they his edict. "Surely you wouldn't do that. Nobody in the land would do that." "Really? They told me you did." Now, Nebuchadnezzar it is, that he is even more powerful than the God of heaven, because he challenges them and says, "Who can deliver you out of my hand?" He demands that they bow to his will instead of God's. And he was very surprised because they would not. You see, Nebuchadnezzar thought like the world thinks, and the world believes that everybody's got his price. God owns it all anyway. So why should we give in to the devil's ploy? When Nebuchadnezzar sees that he can't buy these men, he is truly angry. He is truly angry. And then we see, as we listen to him, that he is expecting them to buckle at any moment, but they won't. You see, they were totally sold out for God. And when we look at the Lord's standard for us, we see some very similar things in Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. "He that loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and he that taketh not the cross and followeth not after me is not worthy of me." And then we find something in Luke chapter 14, just about the same thing that the Savior tells us. That means that we need to make him our top priority. And I assure you, you will never lose as long as God is your top priority. Now, wait a minute, Jeff, though. Look at these guys. They were challenged. I've been challenged. I know what it feels like to be under this kind of stress. Maybe I haven't had my life threatened, but it's a terrible thing to be a social outcast because of my belief system. There's a power play. Look with me back at verse 16 in Daniel 3. "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer you. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up." Here we go now. The threat has been made. Old King Neb knows that they're going to buckle any minute now. He just believes they're going to buckle. And King Neb is he, and they know he has the power to throw them in the crematorium. Now, here's an interesting point. Here's what they say: King, if you choose to throw us in the crematorium, our God has the power to deliver us. But if he chooses not to deliver us, we're not going to go with you anyway. Now let's think about what you and I can learn from that. We can pray that God would utilize his providence to do something to help us in our way, whether it would be to heal our family, or to heal our marriage, or to heal our relationships, or to heal our bodies, whatever it might be. We're praying, and then things just don't work out providentially like we would like them to be. And yet, if we learn the lesson from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're going to stand with God anyway. Why? Because God has something better in store. He always has something better in store. See, he's promised us a place called heaven. A glorious place. Why would we not want to stand with the one who owns it all, who is in control of it all, and who can provide for us a place called heaven? The challenges of this life, the things that we do every day, even coming across town from one side to the other, whatever it is that we do in work or whatever it is that we do in school, all of those challenges that we have, sometimes just don't work out the way we would like for them to. And yet, if we will take the example that we find from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I'll stand in the fire. Because God's got something better in store for me. We look at down to verses 19 through 23, we see that Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury. The King James uses this word visage. It means his face changed. He was red-faced. Ooh, he was mad and some more. You ever seen somebody like that? Mad and some more? Somebody scared you because they were so mad? That's the kind of terror that he had on his face. He was so angry. I'm thinking everybody in this court is thinking, uh-oh, they did it now. Now we're all in trouble. You ever been like that? You know, young folks, you think that the rest of us may not understand this, but if we have brothers and sisters, we get it. That sometimes you push mom and daddy so far that it doesn't matter. Everybody in the house is in that. Okay? And even those of us with white hair, we did it too. And you're thinking, everybody in the court's thinking, whoa, this is real bad news. And maybe those Chaldeans were giggling like a brother and sister would giggle at the one who's getting the most in trouble, and they're thinking they're going to get what they deserve. Therefore he spoke and commanded that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These men bound in their coats, their hose and their hats and their other garments, and they were cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was so urgent, the furnace was exceedingly hot, and the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Now we say to ourselves, how did those guys that were in the furnace, they didn't jump in? What took their lives? How could it have been so hot? You see, when you fight fire, you learn something about superheated air. Air that is so hot that you can't breathe it. It scalds your lungs, you're dead. That's why you see those guys wearing the breathing apparatus. That's why they do that, to protect their lungs from that. So it's very likely that they got so close to that fire, the flame and the smoke, because you see, there's also flame in air that we can't see when it's that hot. And it took their lives. And they threw the other three in, and there they are dead. Now, do you think the people around got a message? You remember who's there? It's a big party. I mean, we've got the sheriffs and the princes and all the list. They're all there, and they all see this thing happening. And then as we see something, that these three Hebrew men thrown into that flame had confidence that God was looking out for their best interest. I've got a question for you. Do you believe that God is looking out for your best interest? Do you really believe that God is looking out for your best interest? Now, we've got to stop and think about that, because we often nod our heads and go, yeah. But then we remember all of the times we've been disappointed. And the devil whispers in your ear, maybe not so much. Now, think about this. He lied to Adam and Eve. He'll lie to you. You'll be thinking about these things and going, oh, maybe not so much. Nobody's looking out for your best interest. I dealt with someone not too awful long ago that had a medical condition that was a problem. And when this became a problem, this was a young person who was at a place where there were a lot of other young people, and they were playing, and they were having a great time. And it was like, oh, we don't want to send her home because she would be so disappointed. I said, I'd rather be disappointed than dead. You see, God is looking out for our best interest. He would rather us work through the things in this life and make it to that glorious place called heaven than for us to ride easy here and then spend eternity in hell. He is looking out for our best interest. And then as we continue to look here in Daniel chapter 3, we see that there's power and peace. Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. He rose up in haste and spoke to his counselors and said, hey, didn't we cast there 3 men bound in the midst of the fire? And they answered and said to the king, true, O king. He said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking about in the midst of the fire. They have no hurt, and the 4th is in the form like the Son of God. King Neb was absolutely astonished. He was surprised to see them and all of what they had done. And as they moved forward, he called them out, because he can. He called them out to him. And when he called them out to him, Nebuchadnezzar began to understand who it was that really had the power. If there's anything that you get from our lesson tonight, let it be this. Our God is in power and in control always. Never let the devil lie to you otherwise. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, yeah, they survived the fiery furnace. And though you and I may live in a land today where we're fortunate enough not to have to worry about necessarily someone threatening our lives with a gun to our heads, that day could come. And if it came, would I be willing to stand with God no matter what? You see, God gives us things in His Word, not just so that we can go home and consider them, but so that we can pre-plan. Do you know what the firefighter would rather do than anything else? He would rather teach fire safety. He would rather people be prepared and not have a house fire, because it's a lot of work to put it out. Nobody wants to see anybody else get hurt. God gives us these things that are written aforetime for our learning so that we won't get hurt. We can begin pre-planning in our minds. When I'm faced with these challenges, how do I respond? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, King, we're not going to worry about carefully answering you here. We're not going to dance around the subject. We're not going to try to be politically correct. We're going to tell you how it is. You have the power to throw us in the furnace, no doubt. But we have a God who can deliver us from that furnace. And if He chooses to, that's great. And if He doesn't, that's too. Because I'm going to stand with Him, because He has promised me something far better, and the God above has never gone back on any of His promises. He's kept every one. So when we think about the challenges that we face, we see that power, the real power of God, truly prospers. It truly prospers when we stand with God. Because then, what do we see Nebuchadnezzar did? He brought them out and he said, okay, their God is the God of all gods, and he made a decree that everyone should honor them and those kinds of things. Now, I think the others that were jealous probably went back and talked about them. Don't be surprised if people still have trouble with you. If you're facing challenges in this life and you stand up for what's right and you prevail, there will always be someone who's trying to undermine you. But keep this in mind. Keep this in mind. Always stand with God, and you will find success. Thank you very much. I guess we'll get, they'll be in here in just a moment. I was told when the second bell went off to be watching here they would come. So thank you again. I'm so glad to be here.
I had plenty of battery in that thing. But
Oh, that's quite all right.
it's still on.
Yeah. That is quite all right.
Now we got plenty. For a while anyway. Hold it down for a little while. Just a few announcements before Brother Jeff comes back and extends their invitation. Several on our prayer list we ask you to remember. We received a thank you note from Evelyn Denny, Jed Bake's friend. It'll be on the bulletin board for your review. You asked to remember Louise Smith, who continues at the hospital in Villa Rica. She had a stent put in yesterday, and surely he should be doing better. Phyllis Glover has some heart tests on Monday. She is awaiting the results of her tests. Phyllis Glover. Tim tells us that daughter Hannah had eye surgery today, and she did well. She's currently in the land of Nod, but she will be recovering from that shortly, but the surgery went well. Hudson DeBerry also had surgery today. Is that right? Did he come through okay? Everything's great. Okay. You're asked to remember Chad's mother, Joyce. She's at the Clee County Nursing Home for Rehabilitation, room 106, and will be there for a few days. Cheryl Edwards' mother, Linda Caldwell, will have a heart procedure September the 6th. Also, you're asked to remember Brother Bud Benefield. Brother Bud is one of the elders at Bowden, and Lola was telling me that Bud has kidney stones, and he's really suffering from that. An interest in our prayer for Brother Bud Benefield would be welcome. Also, I solicit your prayer for my dad, Jerry Stevens. He is to have a heart catheterization Friday week, which will be September the 9th at Piedmont. Are there any others that we should mention? Ladies' Devo is tomorrow morning. Ladies, tomorrow morning, 11 o'clock, and then lunch thereafter, finger foods of the fair. The Good Samaritans will be going shopping. It's going to be about a month or so, Mary tells me, but the food truck from the Children's Home will be here the first part of October, so we got a few weeks, but Mary does solicit resources for a shopping trip for the Good Samaritans to go and get stuff for the Children's Home, so if you wish to help with that, please give your money to Mary. Several gospel meetings starting next weekend. The Waco starts next Friday, September the 9th through the 11th. Jim Murrell, the speaker. At Buchanan, which will be Sunday week, September the 11th to 15th, Brandon Baggett speaking at Buchanan Sunday week through the 14th. Also at Villa Rica, Roy Johnson, that's your uncle, is that right? Roy Johnson, our speaker's uncle, will be conducting a meeting in Villa Rica, again Sunday week, September the 11th through the 14th, Roy Johnson. Also at Lithia Springs, which will begin Sunday week, September 11th through the 15th, Larry Colbreth, speaker. All these would be fantastic to listen to. I'm just ashamed they're all at the same time. Our gospel meeting will be the Sunday after that, September the 18th through the 22nd. That's a Sunday through Thursday. We'll have a potluck after the morning service that Sunday. Brother Rob Whitaker will be conducting that meeting. Hopefully you're all well aware of that by now. Asking you to invite all of your friends, family, neighbors, co-workers, whoever. Have them here for that meeting. And I think I have got it. Brother Jeff. Oh, by the way, the invitation song, 844.
Again, I'm very thankful to be able to be with you tonight. It's certainly been my honor to be with you, and as We've been looking at Daniel chapter 3 tonight and considering this idea of sacrifice, if you will. Those who are willing to sacrifice themselves for God. And I can't help but think about what Paul wrote to the Romans. There, chapter 12, he said, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Now watch this. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable in that perfect will of God. Being living sacrifices, giving ourselves over to God and allowing Him to lead us first. I assure you that if you'll make God first in your life, that you will find success. Did you hear what I said? I assure you that if you will make God first in your life, you will find success. Look into His Word. Look into His Word, and you will find that. You see, He promised us a place called heaven. And it's a great thing to think about, but I would venture to say that most of us really don't want to go into eternity tonight. The fact of the matter is this: the time is coming when we're all going to go into eternity. And in my lifetime, sound blue, but I've had too many opportunities to stand over too many graves, from those who are very young to those who are very old. We've got no guarantee of time. That's why it's so important that we make God first in our lives right away. You see, Jesus said that He is the way, the truth, and the life, John chapter 14 and verse 6. And if we'll follow Him, we can follow Him to that place called heaven. But Jesus tells us in John 8:24 that we need to believe that He is the Son of God. Do you really believe that He is the Son of God? Many people nod their head and say yes, and then that's where they want to be drawing the line. James tells us even the demons believe and tremble. So what does he mean that we need to believe in Him? We need to believe in Him in a way that we're going to take action on that belief. To repent of sin, that means to have a change of mind, another mind actually, if you will. We find that in Luke 13 and verse 3. And then we also find that Jesus said, if we'll confess Him before others, He'll confess us before the Father in heaven. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 32. I don't know about you, but on that day when I stand before the judgment seat, I want Jesus speaking for me, don't you? Now, thinking on this, we can't stand there at that judgment seat with our garments stained with sin. No, we need to come in contact with the blood of Christ through that humble and obedient act of baptism we read in Mark chapter 16 and verse 16. Dear friend, if you've not done those things, I beg you not to let this night go by without making all things right with God. But as a child of God, if opportunities have come your way to do those things that were right, and we let them get by, we weren't really the living sacrifices that we needed to be. Friends, there's nothing that we would rather do than to pray with you and for you that all things be right between you and God. Won't you be His now as together we stand?